Check one, two, check one, two. Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you're having a great week wherever you are in the world. I am Michael Jones, office hours here for MoGraph Mentor. Today we're going to be talking about design, what makes good design, and talking about design principles. But as usual, if you're hanging out and you have any questions about MoGraph Mentor, about the mentorships, about the classes, happy to have that discussion as well here in the chat. I'm going to try to do my best to keep an eye on the chat as I'm going through these slides, and happy to answer any questions that you may have. What's up? What's up? Benzalaconium. I can never tell who's who with all of these usernames. But let's talk a little bit about design. You know, I think design is the hard part for Blaze. What's up, man? Thanks for hanging out. I think design is often the hard part for a lot of people. You know, animation principles, there's design principles, but animation principles can be a little bit more repetitive. When we're talking about visual art and design, it's a little bit, Ian, what's up? What's up, man? It can be a little bit more subjective, right? Because we're talking about visual art, you know, there's graphic design principles, but where is the line between graphic design and illustration, right? And so motion design can be tricky, and the design side of it and the visual art side of it can be a little tricky as well. What's up, everybody? Thank you for hanging out. So the way that I like to think about it, and I stress this always with anybody who, you know, wants to discuss it, is design, right? You can't judge design or critique design without that underlying goal, idea, intent, or meaning. So first we start there, right? There's some kind of core of an idea, and the quality of that really matters, right? If you have a really distilled idea, that's extremely helpful for getting to where you want to go, right? Because then there's the development process. You start with some idea, some intent, but then you actually have to go through a process of seeing that play out, of really putting, you know, pencil to paper or moving pixels around. So we're going to start with that intent. And then we get to design output. And let me make sure my OBS is not totally blocking my slides. Let me just move myself a little bit over here so you can see it fully, right? So, you know, there's that intent, there's that development process, and then there is the actual design output. You end up with something, right? And everybody loves to joke about the, you know, the kind of dark night of the creative soul, where you start a project and you have all these great intentions, and then you end up with something that hopefully is good. A lot of times you might end up hating it because you had a clear, distilled vision in your mind of like creating something amazing. And whether through the client or just through the development process itself, you end up with what you end up with. And the audience or the viewer, right, all they ever see is the design output, right? They're not going to see the process. They just see actually what we ended up with. And it's kind of important to recognize that, right? As like the core problem is, we know what the intent is. We know what the goal is. We understand that underlying meaning, but through the development process, when we get to an actual design output, all the audience will ever see is that output. So that gap between what we intend and what we end up showing the world is a huge part of what we would consider good design, right? So design work is judged on the basis often of how well we're able to translate that original goal, idea, intent into the final design that the viewer sees. So it's really like, you know, if the audience is getting that core thing that you were going for with the visual art, with the design, then that is successful, right? They're not going to know what the intent is. They just can see that final output. So, you know, defining that goal really is like, you know, communicating that intent, emotional goals, right? And a lot of times when you're talking about design and design impact and the way people perceive it, you're talking about emotional goals for the art, for the visual media, right? How do we want the audience to feel? What emotion are we trying to create or try to access in the viewer? Do we want them to, you know, question things? Do we want them to be emotional, be sad, be happy, be filled with joy. You'll hear a lot of, pre-production stuff talk about the emotional response of the audience when you're creating a piece of work, right? And then there's the other side of it, the financial and action-based goals. How do we get the audience to desire this product, right? Maybe the core intent is to make something really appealing, right? So that people want it. How do we present a company in a favorable light, right? If it's more brand building, or how do we get a viewer to actually take action? I know I'm blocking it a little bit, but just to donate, to purchase, to engage, whatever it is, right? And, in motion design, we have the tools to go after those things, right? So it's about those design fundamentals, color, form, texture. But then, we're in motion design, so it is about sound, right? It's about little stylistic choices. It's about overall creative direction. It's about typography and information. So we do judge work on craft, but more so, especially in visual design, especially in graphic design, we judge it on effectiveness, right? Did it capture that core meaning or intent that when we started this process? And so, like in all of our mentorships, when we're asking people to design things, we start with, let's lay out the intent. What is the core thing or emotion or mood or theme that we want to hit with the art, so that when we're looking at the art, we're looking at the design, it's not just about craft, right? Because craft is those design principles, but we're in the communication arts business. So effectiveness is a huge part of that, right? So like I said, craft is the design principles. Effectiveness is about those communication arts, right? Comm arts is the study and theory of how to best communicate through visual imagery. This is what creative directors and art directors at agencies are effectively paid for, making sure that the communication of the art is in line, right? So if you think about it in a really simple kind of matrix to judge your work, right? Something could be both ineffective and bad craft, right? And excuse me, I've got literally an elementary school going on behind me here in the yard, but you shouldn't hear them too much. Things can look bad. There could be bad craft. The work just isn't good, and it's not effective. You could have good craft where it looks good, but it doesn't really communicate at all what the underlying intent is, so it's not effective. It could be effective to an extent, but the craft is bad. And then, of course, what we really want is good craft and effectiveness. So good design, good motion design work is about both the craft, right? Those design principles and those things need to be there, so it's quality and it can stand the test of time. But is it effective? Did you translate that core idea to really communicate with an audience? So let's talk a little bit about craft now. So first things first, when we're talking about graphic design, let's talk about grids, right? Grids are, I swear by grids, especially for a lot of stuff. And if you're doing a lot of 2D stuff, I think grids are super important. They're absolutely fundamental in things like print and web, right? Where everything totally needs to be on a grid. And for a lot of our work too, especially that 2D design work, grids are incredibly important. So if you feel like you're struggling with your design work and you're in that 2D realm and you're not using grids, maybe that's an easy way to improve the craft. The great thing about grids, and here's just an example of an image where if we were to really kind of draw lines over the top, you would start to find the alignment, right? And that design principle of alignment is to create a real structure to your image, right? And grids are a great shortcut for helping you get there. And even if something's a little bit more organic, I still think having grids early in your design process can be really helpful, just to help you think about proportion, right? To think about visual units, to think about scale and size. Anytime we're designing something and we go to a blank page, right? There's no scale. There's no scale established. Us as the designer, as the artist, we're going to establish scale. And that could be anything, right? So we are basically deciding what a large unit and a small unit is within a composition, within a frame. And grids help you create kind of a logical structure for that. So I'm a big believer in grids for certain kinds of work. Let's talk about design principles. First and foremost among them, contrast. But contrast, it doesn't just mean values, right? It certainly does mean values, but it can also mean forms, right? It can mean size, contrast in size, contrast in texture, things that are tactile against things that are not, contrast in color as well, right? So contrast simply means visual differences, and we're designing for other human beings, and the human eye is kind of it's been said, a contrast or an edge detection device. And so, eyeballs are looking for contrast, so it makes it probably the most fundamental design principle to start with, and something to really take seriously, right? Like, if the work isn't that good, a great first question to ask is like, is there enough contrast? And contrast helps you with other design principles as well, like emphasis. If something is extremely contrasted, our eye is going to go right to it, and we're hitting on that idea of emphasis, right? So like a nice example here, credit to Royale for a really interesting looking image here. The more stark and contrasted the image, the harder it is to look away. So there's like a great range of values here. And value structure is another really important thing for designers and visual artists to understand, right? That like everything we look at is actually just values. Color is basically just like a top coat over values, right? Because there are people who can't even perceive color. Like, you can be colorblind, but you're still going to see the world. You're going to see it in shades of white to black, right? And all the grays in between. So having a really strong value structure where like this is 100% white, and there's parts of this image that appear to go to about 100% black. So it's like a 0 to 100 contrast in terms of the value structure of this image, and the photography and everything's really, really interesting, but the contrast makes it really effective, right? So repetition simply means to repeat shapes, forms, colors, kind of a simple one. But I actually think that a lot of people might sleep on this idea, especially in the context of patterns, right? Graphic designers love patterns. And if you really look at a lot of great graphic design portfolios, patterns can be a really big part of it. And especially for us as motion designers, it's important to use that, right? Using patterns can be incredibly powerful, but just this idea of repetition, of just repeating elements to add more designs here, this kind of glitch design that you see so much of, just repeating these same kind of forms. Certainly one way to go about it, right? Here's another example of repetition. If you're like a 3D motion designer, using that cloner is a great, easy way to get a nice repetitive design. There's just something rhythmic about looking at an image where you're seeing something repeated over and over. It has a kind of a pattern-like feel. So that's, again, a really useful design principle to be thinking about. Alignment really comes to us from print and web and that kind of thing, but within motion design is super important and powerful, right? Because it just creates that invisible structure, and our brains are really good at filling in between lines, right? So aligning things really effectively is a great way to create a stronger looking design, right? So like aligning various elements along invisible lines. If we were to draw lines over this, we would see that there are things that are aligned. Like, it feels random and messy, but if you really like look at some of these parts of the design, there's like a perfect alignment going on at certain places. So that is a really helpful kind of design principle. This kind of thing too, where let's say you're using typography and it's very pulled apart and it's more of a design element. It's not really meant to be legible, but you can see the alignment in here, right? Like this K and this E are perfectly aligned. These elements here are perfectly aligned, and these are perfectly aligned along some kind of plane, some kind of line. So right, even if you're doing something like that, alignment becomes super, super important. Proximity is, again, graphic design kind of principles when you want people to read information, right? So like the spacing of elements. So proximity here is having Louisville Cardinals together on this side, and then all this space, and then North Carolina Tar Heels. It's just mostly about coherence and legibility. So here again, proximity, right? Grouping these together, Jared, Goff, these elements here together. You're just you're suggesting the organization of the visual information. So it's a very graphic designy type principle. Getting into some more abstract kind of things, unity, right? Making all elements feel cohesive, right? There's some subjectivity there but not entirely, right? Just like trying to tie together color, form, value. This can be done through simple repetition. Like there's a unity to just repeating the same thing over and over, right? It doesn't feel like incoherent in any way. But there's unity with variety, right? Like making sure, I'm using all circular elements here to design this piece, but they don't need to just be repetitive and uniform, right? It can have an interesting variety, and variety is another really interesting design principle, especially when we're doing super design-driven work, where just making sure you got a diversity, a variety of elements, right? Some lines are totally filled, some are stroked. This is obviously a very simple design, but you can see a lot of great examples of variety where you want just like a lot of different elements, a lot of different colors, a lot of different forms, a lot of different shapes. Variety in and of itself, although it's hard because then you have more to compose and you really need to make sure you've got a nice framing for your shot, nice compositions. But obviously varieties are just a great way to engage our mind, right? When we're looking at visual art like this, just seeing so many different things going on is a really easy way to get people to want to look at your images, right? And there's obviously other beautiful elements to this as well. The idea of balance, right? This is the idea that a visual composition uses the equilibrium of the viewer, right? So even when we're just looking at a still design, something in our brain is like telling us whether it's balanced or it's imbalanced. And you can be imbalanced, and a lot of times that's a great tool or device to suggest movement or to suggest what's coming next. But sometimes you want a composition that just feels balanced, that the eye just rests and takes it in and looks at it. And that's where like a symmetrical or an asymmetrical kind of balance is, in cinematography terms, almost like a closed composition, something that's very, very particularly designed and composed in a specific way. So our eye just kind of rests. We're not looking to necessarily go anywhere else. Like this is obviously very balanced image with this circle right in the center. But given all these elements on the exterior, right, you would definitely call it asymmetrical. And a lot of times you see this over and over, right? There's one element sitting high up on the right, and you got to balance that with a roughly equally sized element down here on the left. So like a very simple example of that nice asymmetrical balance. And again, right, like an even more extreme version of an asymmetrical balance, right? The entire left side of the screen is really, pulling our eye in with all of this fire. And then just having these sitting up a little bit high and to the right just kind of balances it out a little bit. So certainly contextual on what the shot needs, but an important one nonetheless. Emphasis is obviously incredibly important when you really want to direct the viewer's eye. And something we talk a lot about in motion design is like eye flow, of where should I be looking? And a really interesting film or video or ad will often have like a really good eye flow where you're taking the viewer to this side of the composition and the other side of the composition, and you're kind of taking them on this journey to be looking at different parts of your canvas. But emphasis as a design principle is about like, how do you get people to look where you want them to look? And obviously just arranging all the elements right there in the center, or even going back to this kind of thing, like using essentially arrows or shapes that point in a direction, right? Like this is an unmistakable composition of where we're supposed to be looking, especially with all of these converging, almost arrow-like points pointing into the center of the composition, right? And just coming back to this here, it's very, very clear what we're supposed to be looking at. And so the emphasis is kind of unmistakable. The biggest obstacle, we see a lot of people who are very, very new to graphic design or visual design generally, is they will ignore this. They'll ignore emphasis, and there'll be too much going on, right? Like they needed to simplify their design or their shot and just make it easier for me to know where I should look, as opposed to trying to do too much and having too many things for me to look at, right? And so when we're critiquing work and looking at work, emphasis is often like right at the core of how we can improve any kind of design, right? And obviously like simplicity and minimalism does the heavy lifting for you, right? Like emphasis, like, there's nothing else in the shot here. So it's clear we're going to look right at the center, and the value structure of how bright this is and how dark the environment is makes it incredibly easy for where we should be looking. So, emphasis is one of those ones where it's like it should be easy, and it can be difficult for beginners often because they're just doing too much and they need to simplify and realize, for every shot in your film or every shot in your piece, you get one emphasis, right? Don't think that you're going to, be better than this rule and kind of break this rule. Keep it simple, right? There should be one clear place that I'm looking, and that should be obvious. And it doesn't mean you can't have information, right? It doesn't mean there can't be things going on. It just has to be obvious where we want to look, right? So again, and the placement of elements, right, has a ton to do with that. The placement of elements, the values, the contrast drives so much of our ability to emphasize one part of an image over another one. So let's see, one question here in the comments. Hey, Michael, I was just designing my personal projects to create my reel and have been struggling with design and color. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for checking it out. I'm just a big believer that like design principles, help you unlock better looking work. So I'm glad you're checking it out. Proportion, another design principle. This just means, and we talked about it earlier, the designer gets to dictate scale, right? Like in this example here, I'm using like a culturally specific reference of trees. Trees are normally big, so this establishes this element at a much larger scale. Right now, if we took these trees out and we just had this box, it could be microscopic. I don't know the scale, right? So proportion and scale is always about relationships, meaning to establish scale, there need to be at least two elements, right? So like here, again, trees and things that people associate in their mind as large is going to obviously be the easiest way to show scale, right? Like we know trees are big and these mountains, so all of this has a really great scale because this main element is 10x the size of our trees down here. So you really get a sense of a big field of view and a big scale on the shot. Credit to Gunnar on this piece here. Right, and proportion is so interesting and fun, and you see it a ton in motion graphics. That this opens the door to like surrealism or playing with scale and proportion in ways that are playful and interesting, right? Like making guitars the size of a diner or, larger than a cactus, larger than a human being, is just like a fun visual element to show audiences that, right, we know a guitar is normally much smaller than a building, right, or a human being. So again, proportion can be useful to get into those spaces to really either show the scale that you want to show in your image or play around with scale and now start playing with people's perception and get into that more surreal kind of space, right? So rhythm, another really, really big one that people often sleep on when they're starting out. And as people get a little more experienced, and I see this a lot too in our mentorships with people who have a really strong illustration background, that like rhythm and flow gets into the storyboards early. And that's really positive, right? Because having flow and rhythm, like when we talk about design for motion, our work should have a rhythm and a flow because it's going to be animated, right? So thinking about it as a visual principle first is helpful. And then certainly as you're designing storyboards or designing art, that you're thinking about this idea of rhythm or flow, that I feel like that sets your animation up in a stronger place. Like if you can look at the storyboard thumbnail and get a sense of all this flow and movement, that's a great place to be starting your production. So the three types of rhythm: regular, which is just kind of about repetition; flowing, which is as you would imagine, organic flow; and then progressive, which is like repetition with some kind of stepped progression. So let's look at hopefully some examples here. So this one, to me, this is like an interesting example of rhythm because, right, we're definitely getting the sense of like where the movement is coming from. Of course, actual flowing rhythmic elements are very helpful in showing that as well. Here could be an example, right? We just talked about like a progressive rhythm, right? Just repeating this same line over and over at a stepped progression. And then obviously these flowing lines and elements here, right? So you can imagine when you're storyboarding this or you're designing this art, this is someone who, and credit to Ordinary Folk and their team, a great sense about rhythm and about flow in the art itself. And this does so much heavy lifting for you when you're the animator, right? Because you can imagine, all right, these lines are going to come in and these are going to shrink and change sizes. But the design itself, the artwork itself looks so flowing that even with simple animation, you still get something that looks extremely dynamic, right? And just suggests all this kind of flow. And you have these kind of accelerated lines, right? It almost looks like, the shape of a sports car, where you get these really accelerated kind of flowing lines into the image as well, right? And so again, that flow, right, where we're seeing, you can gauge the sense in large part here because they've got a nice little technique of, opacity 100 on this end and opacity 0 on this end. So we're fading down. This is really telling my brain which way the rotation is going. Like I can just look at this image and feel the rotation because of what they've done in the design. And I think it is seeing these, it's almost like a motion blur is applied to this end, telling me which way that rotation is going. So again, a nice looking image and design that has this kind of rhythmic flow to it, where then, the animator can come in and fully bring that to life. But the artwork already looks great. So one more comment here. You're right. After struggling the whole day, I've now simplified my designs a lot and only using 3 colors. Things are looking better. Yeah, the rule of keeping it simple is hard to beat, right? Very often when we're struggling, it's because we're trying to do too much, which can absolutely happen, which I've been guilty of as well. So framing and focus. Let's talk just quickly about some compositional ideas, right? Very classic rule of thirds. You can't quite escape this one, right? This really comes to us from photography and cinematography, that there's just kind of a good, 3-way division, top to bottom, on images. So, composing things on one third, on another third, on a lower left third, a top right third, is just a nice, easy way to not just put things right in the center. I think oftentimes the easiest thing to do is just like, all right, I want the audience to be looking right here, so I'm just going to stick it right in the middle because that's where the eye is going to go. When you're trying to make even better looking stuff than that, especially when you have this issue of eye flow in motion design where you don't just want to keep putting everything right in the center, this is where relying on those thirds to build those compositions is a helpful device. So another big graphic design principle that you see leveraged a lot in motion design is the idea of leading lines, right? Lines that actually lead us through the image, right? And again, you're seeing, and credit to Ordinary Folk, yet again, just an incredible group of human beings and artists, right? Like this flow, like interesting eye flow, there's something very flowing and rhythmic about these lines. But in graphic design, you have this idea of leading lines, that people's eyes will scan the lines. And so this is a great device to either point people directly at something that you want them to look at, or you want them to be like enjoying, this whole design here. So we have these really interesting leading lines kind of working our way through the image from top to bottom. That again matches the core composition, right? You would probably blow this composition up if you didn't match these lines in this same essentially triangular kind of composition with this awesome, straight across foundational base right here. So like a really solid composition, and then those leading lines in there are helpful. Another great graphic design principle: reduce clutter. Just like very often we're probably trying to do too much or show too much. The world's great companies, Google and all the rest of them, when they keep coming out with these very simplistic, very minimal things, but it tells you, right, they've done their research. They understand what is easy, what's easy to use, what's easy to perceive, clear emphasis, a lot of these questions. So sometimes just minimalism and simplicity is really effective communication and design. Sometimes that can hurt as an artist because you want to show off your skills. You want to show off all the techniques and things you can do. But right, sometimes just a circle, sometimes just real simplicity is clear communication. So that's a big one there. So a couple of comments here. So yeah, Blaze, old school designers back in my school days kept repeating that you need to kiss. Keep it simple, stupid, easy to remember for absolute beginners. Keep it simple. Yeah. I don't know how many times early when I was like getting into this whole industry, 13, 14 years ago, trying to learn about design, trying to learn about creating work, how much I was just making it way more complicated than it needs to be. Jacob, thank you for the question. Is there any book you would recommend with all these design principles? Any other resources? I just need to always remind myself of these before jumping on a project. Absolutely, Jacob. So Universal Principles of Design, you can Google that one. It's hardcover, softcover. I think you can get. That's the one that I've leaned on for a number of years, Universal Principles of Design, which is geared towards graphic designers. But as motion designers, we have to basically like learn graphic design and learn animation. So just going into those fields and pulling out the best book, 12 Principles of Animation, Universal Principles of Design is going to get you a long way. So another device, and you see this a lot, and this is getting a little bit more advanced, but as your confidence grows, you can start to do work like this, is like more creative framing. And so if you can look closely, and I know this image is a little bit pixelated, but I've drawn these arrows over the top, right? Mixed perspective and scale. Look at the left side of the image. We have, a fisherman and another individual in a boat at this scale, and they're basically sitting on the horizon line because we're not like looking into the boat. So it's like fully flat across. We have this very flat perspective here. Then we have basically like a giant thumb or a giant finger and some large leaves kind of wiping the frame. And then over here, as the camera is tracking the shot, we're getting a bird's eye view. We're actually looking down into the boat. And you're seeing this a lot these days, especially in motion design, because so much of our animation production, again, is about flow. Like, how do we kill the dead air? How do we keep this thing moving? How can we do a one shot for 2 straight minutes, right? So you're finding these ways, you're trying to find creative ways to flow from one shot to the next instead of just hard cutting like you would, in a cinematic production. So you're seeing this a lot, right? If you can find some transitional element, switching from a very flat horizon perspective on one side to a bird's eye view on another, that's really interesting. And I've seen this technique used a lot. And if it's done well, and of course this is paired with nice illustration, these are absolutely stunning illustrations here, which is necessary, right, to create a great look. But that kind of creative framing is just super, super interesting to me and really advanced. So last one is just using frames, right? We're talking about framing our stuff, just using frames. This is again, out of the graphic design world, but very relevant for us as motion designers is, frames within frames. And you see this with photography too. If I'm going to go and shoot a portrait, someone's high school seniors or whatever, I might have them stand on the other side of a window and use the window to like perfectly frame them within a frame. So within our composition, within that blank canvas, we can use frames too. I thought this is a nice example, right, of not just using a more traditional frame like we're talking about in photography, but this actual organic shape where we're seeing the plant life and these elements kind of burst out of it. So there's this great depth that we're getting immediately out of this frame, out of this image, which is really interesting, right? And getting this overlap just starts to pull apart the image, even though, right, there's not really any lighting to this image. There doesn't appear to be a light source. It's just all flat values. And then the car photo or the car render is just like plopped right into this flat, unlit artwork. But that kind of creative framing device, I think, is a really kind of effective, interesting way to actually kind of help the viewer there. So let's talk a little bit about production workflows. And if there's any other questions, I'll just pause for 1 second here. We have a hard job. I say it over and over and over. We have a hard job. We have to learn graphic design. We have to learn illustration. We don't have to, but like when you see great work and you want to produce similarly awesome work, there's a lot to learn, right? There's a lot that big studios, they hire illustrators, they hire graphic designers, they hire traditional animators, they hire 3D people, they hire technical people. They bring all those multi-disciplines together to create the work we see, right? In 2D production, the general workflow, right? Idea, we still have to start with some kind of idea, some kind of premise, and then sketching. So that's where, when people say, do I need to learn to draw? It's helpful. Drawing is one of the most essential, helpful skills. So I am definitely a big believer, learn to draw, learn to do observational drawing when and where you can, because even if you're just doing more design driven stuff, like this is obviously very narrative looking. This almost just looks like animation production, like 2D feature film animation production. But even if you're just doing simple stuff, squares, basic shapes, like just having a bit of perspective and draftsmanship is really helpful, right? So sketching, right, we're going to see everything in wireframes, typically everything in just flat values and just forms and shapes. Then Illustrator, Photoshop, where we find art direction. Then After Effects, or Adobe Animate as well, where we bring things to life. And then things like Premiere Pro and Audition, media encoding, that kind of final finishing. So right, in 2D production, we have to lean very heavily on sketching to validate and work through our ideas. It's the fastest way to block out, storyboard, or communicate an idea before committing to execution. And again, this is a very narrative example. And if I actually bring up one other example from Matisse's portfolio that I'm just going to very quickly pull. Let's go ahead and pull this one in just ever so quickly. Like this shot here, I think is interesting. This is not narrative, right? This is just like random shapes and objects coming at the camera. And yet still, when you look under the hood of that production, and this was for a music video that was really beautifully done, and the designer on this, art director, was Sophie Lee. When you look under the hood of this production, Matisse is still doing, he's on like version 20 of the animatic, right? He's on version 20 of this before he's ever going to worry about actually rendering this stuff in After Effects and like really getting everything, getting all the Photoshop art and completing that animation. So that's why I say, this is the fastest way to validate ideas. And so even if it's just shapes and things happening, you see it at big studios, you see it with awesome artists. They are 100% doing a hand-drawn, animatic over and over and over. And then once everything is awesome and dialed in, then you're putting on the color, then you're putting on that top coat of that final art direction. So it's just a super important part of the process. So one question here. I think my main problem is that I want my work to look like the motion design pieces coming from top studios. Yeah, I think we all want our work to match the standards of our industry, 100%, right? Like how could we not? How could you not want that? Like the fact that you want that is good. The problem is when you unpack all the disciplines at play in their work, then you realize, okay, if I want to do that on my own, I need to be better at illustration. I need to be better at graphic design. I need to be better at cinematography, right? Because the other part of this kind of work too is you're also the photographer, right? In 2D or 3D work, there's a camera somewhere, and there is a whole set of disciplines about using the camera, first person, third person, omniscient view, close framing, open framing. There's the whole pantheon of cinematic theory about how you use the camera to tell stories. And so, at these studios, they even have, they're thinking about that part of it too, right? It's not just being good at graphic design or just being good at animation. It's like bringing all those things together that produces that absolutely high level work. And so if you want to work at those studios, understand that you'll need a specialty, right? They're not going to hire you because really nobody can do all of it, right? You're going to come to them to be like, I'm absolutely obsessed with storyboarding or character design or traditional animation or After Effects animation or design and art direction or sound design or whatever it is, that thing that your amazing thing that you want to bring to them, because studios build teams of specialists quite typically. So that's certainly a big part of it. So one question here, do you need to be good at drawing? You certainly don't need to be good at drawing. You need to be able to just like communicate enough about the idea. Now you need to be good at drawing if you want to do your own character designs, you want to design your own environments, you want to, let's quickly bring up Rommel's portfolio. If you want to be like Rommel Ruiz and do the storyboarding and art direction, right? Like, well, then you're going to need to be good at drawing because there's a ton of drawing, right? Like if you want to do backgrounds for MoGraph pieces, right? Well, you're going to need to go out to the park. You're going to need to make sure you understand perspective drawing. You're going to need to go do observational sketching and painting so that you get values in your mind, like this value structure of, these elements fading out into the distance, into this brighter value, things being close up to the camera, being this darker value, those kind of painterly principles. So it just depends on what you want to do. If you want to be the After Effects animator and just go absolutely ham on like animating circles and squares and shapes, then no, you don't need to be good at drawing. You're going to have to go get a job with other people who maybe get you to the point where you're using your skill set. But right, it's obviously just depends there, Ian. So always pushing for that top quality stuff. And then when things don't land well, I tend to scrape the project and move on to something new. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of iteration in our industry, so I wouldn't feel too bad. And once you make an attempt at something and fail, you actually learn a lot, right? Then you're going to learn what you really need to focus on, and that can be useful as well. So then in 3D production, very similar, right? Like idea, sketching. Now let's add the idea of wireframing, which is huge. Look development, textures, surfaces, lights, rendering, all those kinds of things, animation, rendering stuff out, and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So one comment here, gotta just keep learning and do the work. That's the best advice anybody could ever get. Just keep learning, just do the work. One day, 10 years from now, you're gonna look up and everyone's gonna look at your work and be like, holy cow, how do you know all this? But it will just be one day at a time. So absolutely loved this 3D production from Gunner. They did for some conference titles, I believe. But it shows you how, like, even with good 3D work, a lot of it is still resting on visual development and illustration. I think that illustration and illustrators might be a little bit overlooked and undervalued in our industry because so much traditionally it's been, design in motion, graphic design and putting it in motion, design for motion, the famous book from Austin Shaw. But so much of the top work we see today is like illustrators doing visual development, drawing interesting looking characters, right? Animal characters, human characters, environments, landscapes. The line between like Disney production and advertising graphic design production is meeting in the middle, and we're getting all this illustration and viz dev in with, Cinema 4D and animators and all this other kind of thing. So that to me is really exciting, right? That line is blurring where even on 3D production, you still need good visual development. You still need people who are thinking about good forms, right? Good design, good illustration to kind of bring that stuff to life. Right? So even in 3D, we still lean on sketching to validate and work through ideas, right? I don't know how you would be able to just create a 3D character out of thin air without at least some kind of sketch that's giving you the shape language, right? And especially if you're in an actual client context, you can't just create and rig up a bunch of 3D characters out of thin air. You're going to want to validate all that through sketching and through drawing. So a lot of production still rests on sketching as well. So Vivek says, any tips for PSAs or explainer videos? Yeah, thank you for the question. We can talk a little bit about that in a second. Explainer videos. The best advice I think I could give for explainer videos is to really, really nail the graphic design principles, right? Look at people like Ordinary Folk. Let's bring up some of their work. I think you could call their portfolio like primarily explainer, right? Like here, SAP wants them to explain about their new ventures and technologies initiative, right? And this is so common. Some corporation says, hey, we have this new thing. We need to tell everybody about it. We need to explain it. And this is where, we were looking at an example like this where those basic graphic design principles are super important. value structure being important, and then things like iFlow, right? Like taking us on a little bit of a journey through a kind of piece. I think the people who do this kind of work, like they build up a reservoir of techniques that get used over and over and over again, right? So like, and that helps you in the storyboarding for the next one, because it's hard to storyboard an explainer video without thinking about all the cool stuff you can do in After Effects. Like here, like that's a really cool shot, and this is a really lovely shot too, where like you can just create the faux 3D in After Effects, right? So when I storyboard that out real quick, I already have a sense of like how that's going to work in animation, and maybe I can put that into an animatic. So I think experience is certainly part of it, but design principles are a huge part of it, right? Okay, repetition. We just talked about repetition. We talked about flow. We talked about a progressive flow, repeating elements that change in size. I think you could basically freeze frame and like some interesting like Gestalt kind of optical illusion design stuff happening here as well. And if we frame through this, you can see the layers break apart, right? So that's actually just 2D layers being made to look like an interesting optical illusion, and as long as it's quick enough, you're going to kind of get away with it. So, all that to say, Vivek, and thank you for the question, is, great explainer videos often hit on all these things, right? Emphasis, contrast, balance, asymmetrical balance, and then those 12 principles of animation, right? Like so much of this shines because everything has like those animation principles baked into it, right? Like the ease in, ease out, or right there, the ball hits and there's an overlapping action and it snaps back. So just using those graphic design, this is very much a good example of graphic design in motion, right? There's nothing too illustrated here. We don't see characters walking around, like it's literally just shapes. And so if I was really wanting to, get better at explainer videos or really make it my thing that I want to sell, I would just study. I would study, like come into a film like this, take like 30 screenshots, right? Just go through the whole film, take 30 screenshots, bring it into Photoshop and lay it out like a storyboard, right? And you will have just kind of reverse engineered the way that they thought about it. And then look at that. Think about the way that they're hitting you with different designs, different compositions. They're not just repeating the same thing over and over, even though like in some sense here, everything's very centered in this film, right? We just were looking at that cube and all the action was happening in the center, and they're doing that again, but now, right, we're dividing up the frame. We have all this contrast, right? We're using this inverted kind of like negative space design. And so I think the people who are doing it at the absolute highest levels, they want good design, right? They want good graphic design. They want great eye flow to make sure they're being, you're taking the audience on a journey and you're giving them different things to look at. So they're trying to push themselves to come up with creative solutions for each composition. Like here, awesome example. Props to After Effects for the new, null to path, null to shape layer path technique that After Effects gave us a few versions back. That's really lovely. We talked about flow. We talked about rhythm. I think they're just doing their best to, on the one hand, they're being given a set of script or text. So they're trying to come up with visual metaphors too, but they're keeping it very rigid to graphic design. And I think that's smart. And if you do enough good work, then you can get clients to accept this kind of thing. Whereas clients a lot of times are very insistent on, oftentimes creating bad work, right? Wanting characters where they don't need to be, or things like that. So Vivek says, is it okay to copy explainer video to learn, like the whole process? Yeah, I think if you're just learning and you're just messing around, like go and look at these shots and go recreate them in After Effects, right? That's absolutely 100% fine. You even see in art schools, like sometimes your first year illustrators, they might even ask them to look at a famous painting or a famous illustration and just copy it, just try to recreate it. Because when you're still learning, imitation can be helpful. Now I think, you're doing that early in the process so that you just understand enough of the context to do it originally on your own later, because obviously you're going to get yourself into a world of trouble if you're just ripping off studios, because it's kind of a small world in MoGraph land. So I would definitely not be ripping off people's designs or animation concepts for something that you're really selling. But if you're tinkering and you're not going to be posting that stuff online, 100%, like try to reverse engineer stuff. Think about how they did it, because that's really helpful, right? Things like match cuts here. Absolutely love this match cut. Let's actually frame by frame through this. So we start and we're just getting this motion blur on here, but you can't really use motion blur enough to create this next effect. So let's see, as this starts to turn, you see then they actually expand those shapes and then just cut to this next one where now we're just moving to these shapes, then even another cut, and then getting to that final design that no doubt the graphic designer or the art director, right? Because a lot of times that's often the hardest thing about our job, is translating art direction, translating designs into animations, right? Because it's one thing to design something in Photoshop as a bunch of layers, or Illustrator as a bunch of layers. It's another thing to get in between those designs, right? And so that's where studying animation principles and being able to do your own in-betweening is essential. If you're going to be the animator on the job, you've got to really feel confident you can get from this shot, right, all the way to the next shot, because I guarantee you the graphic designer probably is not going to take the time to do these in-betweens. And you can see how rough that in-between looks, but it's just enough, right? Like it's just enough, because probably now we're to the artwork that I just received from the art director here. So that is often a challenge, especially if you're in the After Effects seat and it's like, all right, the designer did the boards, so now you got to figure it out, how to bring it to life. There's the problem of just like dealing with the layers. Does everything translate to After Effects? And then how do I get from one shot to the next? Sometimes you got to be really clever and creative. But if you understand those traditional animation principles, and that's why I'm always encouraging people, if you really want to be in the animator seat, make sure that you're also tinkering with Adobe Animate, that you're also playing around with hand-drawn animation, because you really, really need to understand it at a deep level, right? Even for stuff like this. This isn't hand-drawn animation, but it kind of almost is. You can see they're filling in-betweens with just random shapes, because the animator just knows enough to know it's going to look fine when it plays back, right? And so when we watch it back, it's fine, right? It looks just fine. So that's why I'm also a big believer in like be tinkering with Adobe Animate. We put some stuff on the YouTube channel, like quick kickstart guides to Adobe Animate. Check that out if you're interested in tinkering there. Make sure that you can do a basic ball bounce. Make sure you can do a basic flowing shape, hand drawn. Like those foundational ideas are super important, even if you're just going to be in the After Effects animator seat, to really do next level work and not make it look clunky or just get overly reliant on doing the same thing over and over, right? It's one thing to learn about the graph editor curves and be like, cool, I know how to make a snappy thing move with the graph editor. It's super important to understand animation at an even deeper level than that, so that you can creatively problem solve, getting from one shot to the next and just have that ultimate kind of control. Also sets you up for these kind of match cut moves, right? Like here we come to a great ease, and then we just match cut right to that next one. But that whole cut between the two shots was like a single ease in, ease out with the cut coming at the highest point of the velocity, even though it's two different shots with totally different artwork. That's the kind of thing that like just learning the graph editor, it doesn't do that for you, right? It has to be in your mind that that's what you want, right? And you're using animation principles more than just manipulating the graph editor. You got to know how the graph editor works, obviously, but it's deeper than that to do really good work, especially across stuff like this that has so many layers and can be a bit complicated. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for hanging out. Let me come back to the start of this design principles where we started, right? Just to loop it back. We start with that idea, that intent. It goes through some process, usually gets butchered, and then we get that output. All the audience ever sees is that output. So like how good are you at getting that original intent into a final image? That's hard, right? People spend their whole life studying graphic design and communication arts to master that. And so it is a learning process. If you're not great at it, don't despair. I mean, people really do work a lifetime. It is that 10,000 hours or that creative tension where you're never where you want to be. I'm not where I want to be. I don't know any artist who's even doing awesome work who's where they want to be. There's always the next thing to learn. You could always be better and more effective with what you're doing. And so it's literally just showing up every single day and doing the work. So one last question here. What if my work looks influenced by others' work? Early on in my career, as everything I think of feels like has already been created. I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think, even when you look at ordinary folks' work, I feel like their work is really heavily influenced by a lot of other studios and a lot of other artists, actually. I don't feel like this is just so original. It's too hard to think that everything's going to be totally original. So, we're not wanting to copy what other people are doing or rip people off. I guess the real question is, are you just emulating someone else because you think that's the right thing to do? Or is this the work that you love? It speaks to you. And sure, maybe other people have similar work, but you have your own reasons to be working in a specific way, right? Like you really love shape-driven stuff and you love the way these gradients are used. Like nobody has a patent, nobody has copyright on using gradients on shapes and simple shapes, right? And because it's quote unquote graphic design in motion, it's like graphic design, everything's been created, right? The mixed media, the minimal, right? The psychedelic, the Saul Bass style, like in graphic design, everything's been done. So there's really a larger question of just like, what kind of career are you looking for? What's the work that speaks to you? And those kinds of questions there. So I wouldn't worry too much that it looks influenced necessarily by other people's work. If you're worried that it looks like too much of a ripoff, then yeah, I mean, you definitely, and right? If you're just stealing shots from people because it's a badass shot and you're like, hey, I want to do that shot too, then yeah, maybe that's not ideal. But originality is not really the goal, I don't think, right? And even talking about like effectiveness, it's like, does it have craft and is it effective? Does it communicate? And craft, we all have the same craft, right? There's set principles of design. So our work is going to look similar, right? The way that we lay out compositions and all these kinds of things. So can you suggest some sites for 2D animation inspiration? Yeah. Is Wine After Coffee still going strong? Have we all abandoned Vimeo? Is anyone still using Vimeo at this point? Wow, created 11 years ago, uploaded 3 weeks ago. Yeah, they're still managing this account, so that's awesome. Wine After Coffee has a ton. Now it's not just 2D; it's just like great work generally. So I think that's actually an awesome place to start. Yeah, that's really nice. This is for Spotify. That's really beautiful. Wine After Coffee is one. Yeah, that looks really killer. Gosh, what's the other one? What's his Tumblr? I forget. Yeah, if anybody has any good 2D inspiration channels for Vivek here, throw that in the comment for him. Yeah, I'm not a big inspiration guy, so other people probably know way better than me, where to go look at great work. But for me, it's just like trying to keep up with the major studios and like seeing them push the envelope. Or, right now my obsession is following illustrators, right? Just like editorial illustrators, just people who do, various kinds of editorial illustration work as well, because that's where I want to get better. So Jacob says motionographer. Hey, industry standby. Let's see. Good old motionographer. Still doing it. Still doing their thing. Yeah, lots of cool work. Hey, Zach got on there. That's awesome. Yeah, I think the commonality though is like whether it's 2D or 3D or whatever it is, just the principles of design and visual art are well represented, right? Like it doesn't almost matter the medium. Good design is good design. So Dribbble, ArtStation, Behance, yeah, lots of places where you can find good inspiration, right? Inspiration should be easy to find these days because there's just so much work and so much going on. So thank you all so much for hanging out. Again, MoGraph Mentor, we've got the mentorships. We're right in a semester right now. We did launch the on-demand pricing where for $29 a month, you can access basically all the courses that we have. And we've been doing this for a number of years. We do the technical training because it is also a technical job, right? Like there's just so many different techniques and technical elements and, 3D, 2D, visual development, rigging, all these kinds of different things that seemingly go into our job, and everyone's finding their own lane, their own niche in the industry. And then once you reach a certain point of technical expertise, that's where we feel like mentorships make sense for people, where you're really serious about, formatting the portfolio, maybe a couple more personal projects that are just going to hopefully move you in the right direction. So if you're a total beginner, I don't know that I would recommend necessarily doing a mentorship. I would maybe just jump into learning stuff for free online or doing some kind of low-cost option that we have here. But yeah, man, that's what we're about. And thank you all so much for hanging out. We'll be back next Wednesday for another office hours. Best of luck to all of you, whatever you're working on this week. Have a great week. Gosh, the month of September has flown by. How is that even possible? But thank you all so much for hanging out, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.